Welcome to the New School. I'm Andrew White. I direct the Center for New York City Affairs, which is a research institute here at the New School devoted to advancing innovation in social policy. And we do a great deal of research on public education, child welfare, juvenile justice, community schools, and much more. We're also home to InsideSchools.org, which is a tool for parents and young people to learn about their schools, learn about which schools to go to in the city. So I hope you'll check that out and check out our website, NYCHA.org. We're based at the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy, which trains some of the best social justice practitioners in the city and now the world. So on to this morning's topic. In February, we had a forum on NYCHA and the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. And that discussion touched on some of the issues we'll discuss in greater depth today, although we'll hit a lot of other issues as well. One of the highlights of that conversation, I thought, was the general agreement among the panelists that some neighborhoods had a community capacity to respond to the hurricane and to crisis that other neighborhoods didn't. The Lower East Side has a long history of organizing, a lot of community-based organizations, a lot of informal resources that Far Rockaway doesn't have. Some places don't have much in the way either of subsidized childcare, after-school programs, family preventive services, and so on, that can help out in a crisis. And in that sense, we were talking not only about a crisis like a hurricane, but the long-term, day-to-day crisis of survival in communities where most residents are very low-income working parents with children or retirees. So the conventional wisdom about public housing in this country is that it's pretty much the housing of last resort for people who have nowhere else to go. The reality in New York City is something somewhat different. In fact, there are not a lot of people on cash public assistance anymore. Welfare is a shadow of what it once was, and if you're poor and want help from the government, you're better off working. If you have kids, you can get a decent boost through the earned income tax credit and through food stamps and other sources. But here's the deal, public housing is a core part of New York City's neighborhood life and its culture and its economy, and it accounts for nearly 1/10 of the city's rental apartments. And yet, even so, it's a scarce resource, a contested resource. 50,000 single elderly people live in NYCHA apartments, according to the census. And so do more than 33,000 single moms with children under the age of 18. In a city where so many jobs pay so much less than a living wage, there are well over 100,000 working people living in public housing who are able to pay an affordable rent, and it's hard to imagine where they might live otherwise. There's two other great big points of context for today's discussion, and a lot of smaller ones that I'll leave to the panel and to the moderator. But the two big ones are these. By its own calculations, the New York City Housing Authority has run a cumulative loss in its operating subsidy of $857 million since 2001. The agency's staff costs alone are close to $1.3 billion per year, and utilities cost more than $540 million. And yet the federal subsidy for the housing authority is barely $900 million a year. So the problem is now, with budget sequestration and other proposals floating around Congress, the housing authority is likely to continue losing federal support. So how will public housing in New York return to financial sustainability? The other issue on the table is this. For 20 years in cities all over the United States, public housing's been torn down and replaced with mixed income housing. Some tenants have gotten rent vouchers, others have simply moved on. And it's been going on in one form or another long enough that it's become the conventional solution. And yet for 20 years, New York has managed to outrun Hope 6 and preserved the cityscape in so much of the Bronx and Brooklyn and Manhattan and Queens. But how long can New York remain this great exception, even with a Democrat in the White House and a former city housing commissioner, Sean Donovan, running the Department of Housing and Urban Development? So I know those are a few bombs, but that's the framing that we wanted to put on this, because it's a little bit scary, I think, in a city where we've managed to retain public housing as it was meant to be in its original vision in so many, for so many decades. There's a lot more to this discussion, including the question of NYCHA's responsibilities to its tenants and City Hall's responsibility to NYCHA's budget and the political relationship between the biggest city in the United States and the federal government. So from that, we're going to have a conversation with the panel, and with about a half hour to go, we'll open it up to the audience. First, I wanted to thank Andrea Marpiero Colomina and Jackie Wayans for handling the logistics and much of the planning for this morning. I want to thank the center's many funders, some of whom are here in this room. We couldn't do this without you. We're at Center NYC on Twitter, and you can tweet, for those on the live stream, also you can tweet about this event using the hashtag public housing. So we're live streaming. The video will be available on the website after the event is over. There you go. Many of you know Errol Lewis from your evenings at home sitting on the couch watching Inside City Hall on New York 1. Or you know him from CNN, or you know him from the Daily News. Some of you may remember him from the Central Brooklyn Partnership. I'm very pleased to have Errol here again to guide this discussion, which he will do so well. Errol.
Thank you, Andrew. And for purposes of today's panel, I am also an alum or former resident of the Manhattanville houses in West Harlem. Thank you all for coming, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. We've had some other discussions, including one I remember during the Bush administration, where we actually made quite a lot of news. We had the regional administrator from HUD here who said something he probably ought not to have said, and it sort of tipped the administration's hand on a proposal that was largely voted down here in the New York region. But we've got some really important folks here, and I can't wait to hear what they have to say. And I want to tell you what the format's going to be, and then I'll introduce the panelists, because I'm not sure they know exactly what they're in for here. And then we'll start our conversation. I'm going to talk with each of the members of the panel. I'll invite them to tell us for about 5 minutes what they think, basically to share their vision of public housing and how to get it back on track and define that any way that they would like. I'll also ask them a few questions, and we'll go in the order that you see them seated here. And then after that, we're going to start a discussion among the panelists about different strategies and different opportunities that they see out there. And of course, you'll be invited to join the conversation, as Andrew said, before the end of our time this morning. Let me give you some brief introductions. They all wear multiple hats, and they all have done quite a lot. I'm going to give you the thumbnail version, and also ask the panelists to, in a setting like this, you don't necessarily have to speak from your quote-unquote position. You can argue for whatever you'd like. We're all New Yorkers here, and we're all trying to figure out a really tough problem that seems to not go away year after year. Julio Vitullo Martin is a senior fellow at the Regional Plan Association and director of the Center for Urban Innovation. Her work focuses on development issues such as planning and zoning, housing, waterfront development, environmental review, building and fire codes, and historic preservation. She also writes some very intriguing stuff about crime and its consequences for neighborhoods. And she's been published just about everywhere. She's authored and edited 3 books, including Breaking Away, The Future of Cities. Next to her is Emily Yusoff, who is vice chair of the board of the New York City Housing Authority, who is a veteran in the fields of finance and housing with an extensive background of over 30 years of leadership positions in the public and private sectors. Most recently, she served as president of the New York City Housing Development Corporation. Hi, Damaris.
Hi.
I did not see you come in. Damaris Reyes is executive director of Good Old Lower East Side, which is a housing and preservation group that has worked in the Lower East Side since 1977. She's also served as an advocate in the Baruch Houses Tenant Association, where she is a resident. And she was a key member of a Community Board 3 committee drafting a plan for the Seward Park urban renewal area. And in 2009, she was awarded the Jane Jacobs Medal for New Ideas and Activism. Next to her is Rosie Mendez, the councilperson representing District 2 in the council. She was elected in 2005, so she's not term limited. She's going to be here for a little bit, I think. She serves as chair of the Council Committee on Public Housing and is a member of the Landmarks Subcommittee and the Housing, Land Use, Health, and Lower Manhattan Redevelopment Committees. Before her election to the council, she served as Democratic district leader and was chief of staff and legislative aide to the prior councilwoman, who many of you know, Margarita Lopez. And last but not least, David Gilmore is here. He is a founder of the Hope 6 program, which is the longtime national model to replace traditional public housing with mixed income and lower density housing. He's currently the administrative receiver of the Housing Authority of New Orleans. He was appointed by HUD Secretary Sean Donovan in November 2009. He also is, in the past, he served as the founder of Gilmore Kane LLC to provide consulting experience to both public housing authorities and private developers of affordable housing. He is currently a lecturer at American University and at the University of Maryland in the School of Public Policy. And we have a whole lot to talk about, so I'm going to start with you, Julia. Talk to us for about 5 minutes about where you think things ought to go. And I know you have many, many ideas, and those of you who don't mention, I will try to drag out of you. But how did we get to where we are, and how would you frame the conversation that we need to have? I mean, from one point of view, just reflecting the statistics Andrew talked about, on one level, maybe this is a federalism problem. Maybe it's a political problem. Maybe it's a dollars and cents problem. You always surprise me, so I'm sure none of those are entirely right. So why don't you get us started?
Thank you, Errol. Well, Andrew gave us an excellent introduction with a lot of the most important statistics. There are a few I'd add. I heard Fred Harris recently say that at most 50% of NYCHA's operating expenses are covered by rent. I mean, Emily can tell me if that's wrong, but excuse me. And he also said that the capital investment backlog at NYCHA is at least $6 billion and that it's growing at a rate of $3 million a day. So in other words, NYCHA faces extremely serious financial problems, so serious that the finances of the housing have to be, I think, the most important question in front of NYCHA. Now, NYCHA also is in the very unfortunate condition of being essentially an orphan. It's been abandoned by the federal government, which started public housing in the 1930s. I mean, New York also claims to be first with first houses and so forth, but basically, public housing in the country was a federal program. The federal government's moved away from public housing very decisively. Hope 6, which has many admirable ideas in it, was a program devised by the federal government in part to overcome the inadequacies it saw in its own program. New York, for many reasons, did not participate very much in Hope 6, in part because New York believes, and I think this is true, that most of its buildings are in far better condition than most public housing buildings across the country. So New York tried to hold on to its housing stock. And New York also has been in the unique position of, among large housing authorities, of always having a very high demand for its housing. Never has the demand for public housing in New York gone down. I think when I was first interested in public housing in the 70s, the waiting list was something like 50,000, and it's now, I don't know, 165? Or, I mean, who knows what it really is. If NYCHA housing were upgraded and made available to all New Yorkers, it'd be like a blockbuster. The demand would be so great. Now, having said that, though, NYCHA's problem is it doesn't have federal support. It's not going to get substantially more support from the Obama administration. President Obama worked in public housing in Chicago. when he was young. He worked at Altgeld Gardens on the far southwest side. He's in no way indicated he's going to move forward a strong public housing initiative. Actually, he's indicated the opposite. The state government, state of New York abandoned public housing a long time ago. So there's the city government, and there are many proposals for moving around tax levy to get NYCHA more money, but essentially those proposals are moving around tax levy. So NYCHA is proposing to do with its land lease program what it has to do and what any landlord with this kind of housing stock would propose to do, which is look to its own resources. You know, there are many elements to this proposal. It could be done in a different way. NYCHA is proposing developing the parking lots. I think there's a huge amount to be said for that across a very large policy range, especially since NYCHA is saying it will not displace tenants. What's more, NYCHA is trying to do something that other public housing authorities have tried to do, some successfully, some not, and that's re-urbanize its projects. That is, make them more diverse, bring in retail, make the streetscape more attractive, and that, in my opinion, is immensely important. In other words, NYCHA is trying to undo the Jane Jacobs criticism of public housing. She was very harsh on public housing, and she called projects self-isolating. So the set of proposals now in front of us would in part combat that criticism, which I think is very important.
And Julia, what do you think might be some of the motivations for public housing, especially here in New York, being orphaned? Why would, say, Albany and Washington turn their backs on public housing?
Well, you know, public housing was essentially a New Deal program. So it's an old program, and we don't actually have that many New Deal projects left. We have programs left. We have Social Security and TVA, a few, very few. And public housing has not been able to evolve in the way that Americans expect social programs to evolve. Even in New York, which probably does have the best public housing in the country, you don't see the evolution in public housing projects that you see in other neighborhoods in New York. You don't see, I mean, New York is a city of great dynamism and energy and change, and housing projects are far more similar to what they were originally than most neighborhoods in New York are. And I think that's part of the problem.
I've always been struck by how there is, well, a bit of personal biography, and I'd like to sort of, it'll lead to a question. My father was a New York City police officer. He had a family of 5 kids. He was the sole breadwinner, and one of them was special needs. And we lived in the Manhattanville houses for a number of years. Our next door neighbor was a toll taker for Triborough. Across the street was somebody who worked for the Police Athletic League. There was a nurse down at our end of the hall and so forth. And it was understood. I mean, I'm reconstructing this after the fact. I was just a kid, but it was understood that we weren't going to be there very long. And we weren't. We were there for less than a decade until he could sort of scrape some money together and buy a house, and then we moved out. That to me is one particular way that I know intimately of how to use public housing. Was that the original vision of it, or was it supposed to be a place where, you talk about dynamism, a lot of people have stayed and really built communities. That's a different kind of dynamism than the way we use the housing.
Well, I think that, Errol, your question is the basic one and the most important one, which is, does public housing help put its residents on the ladder to upward mobility, or doesn't it? And we know public housing has put many people on the ladder of upward mobility. You, Errol, and I have many friends who grew up in public housing and who are immensely successful people on all grounds. And this is true across the country. But for a whole variety of reasons, first of all, in part because the waiting list is so large and the New York market, there is no vacancy in New York, certainly not for affordable housing. People don't move out of public housing. That was never the intention. And the question of federal policy encouraging people to move out has over the years been a prime federal intent, especially when the Republicans were in power, and that had dire consequences as well. But now we've gotten public housing. There's a criticism conservatives make. I hate this term, but I think it actually has some validity here. They call public housing the frozen city because it is so hard for people to move in, people don't move out. Other systems have discouraged that, and perhaps we should in New York too. I mean, perhaps we should encourage more mobility in New York.
Okay. So let me bring you into this, Emily. From your point of view, and you're managing, you've got a leaky boat at a minimum. It's a battleship, but it's got some leaks in it. And how do you see this moving forward? In other words, I know that there are the day-to-day struggles. I've talked about them with the chairman quite frequently. If you want to sort of maybe expand your time horizon, where do you think we go, and why do you think we're in the current position?
Well, I think the first thing everyone needs to understand, just to clarify how large NYCHA is, it's 179,000 units, 420,000 tenants. When you add in our Section 8 population, which is another 220 families, from 92,000 vouchers that are housed in about 30,000 different buildings throughout the city. Our population is bigger than the city of Boston. So it is a huge issue. In my thoughts, and having spent time there and grappling with the problems, which are, immense, I will say that I think what has to happen is a change in the way we look at public housing. The public housing history was, yes, it was initially set up for the working families, and most of them did move on and out. There was a move at one point to have public housing really take in more homeless, and we do have 20% of our population who is homeless, but there's always a lot of pressure to do more. The first decision is, what does everybody want public housing to be? We don't think of it as housing as last resort. We do think of it as a place that does house working families. Our population of, if you take out the senior citizens, most of whom are on Social Security or pensions, and the majority of them were working families at one point, the 55% of our tenants do work. And they do, while the incomes are low, we have done a lot of research lately, and we'll be coming out with a report shortly on this, but we have, our population really fuels the economy by providing the workers who work in retail establishments, who drive buses, who still are nurses, health aides, all the school aides. We have a lot of people that if they move out of New York because we get rid of public housing or, make the population smaller, I don't know who's going to fill those jobs. They are very important positions. And there's a whole question about how far would they have to move to be able to afford to live, and then would it be worth them to come in and do the jobs that they are doing? I think the conversation also is, if we're going to keep it, and I think we absolutely need to maintain the public housing in New York City, then how do we do that? We are in an odd position because we're a state authority, we're city appointed, and we're federally funded. And so nobody really wants responsibility. Everybody wants to step away and go, well, you fund them or you fund them, but it's hard to find somebody who is really there to help. We have to look at new ways of getting the funding. There are a couple of ideas that, we've been talking about. Land lease is one, but and while it's a good way to begin, it is not enough to solve the NYCHA problems. And those problems really have to be solved through other mechanisms. Because I firmly believe, and I think it's well documented, you need to have the housing to be safe, clean, and affordable, and you need to maintain it. And NYCHA has not been able to maintain it, as you said earlier. From 2001, our capital budget was $427,000 a year, and in 2013, the feds reduced it to $250,000. That's a lot, and it's been a steady decrease over the time period. So to be able to provide that clean, stable, safe housing for people, you need the funds to maintain it, bring it up to, code, and code, when I say code, meaning bring it up to a livable standard that anybody would be happy to live in. So we've come up with a couple of ideas I'd like to, talk about. One of them is to take, based on the idea of the low-income housing tax credit, and make a public housing tax credit. That is a much more efficient way for the federal government to fund as opposed to sitting and writing checks, because that is considered an expenditure from the federal government, and you know exactly what the cost is going to be over the term of those tax credits. One of the problems with rental subsidies is you cannot control the cost of the program, and there's no way to fully anticipate what those costs are going to be, given not only because of repairs, but also the cost of utilities and services, as you said. So with a program like that, it would be a change. I'm not saying taking away from low-income housing tax credits, but have the federal government give more tax credits that are just designated for public housing. Those tax credits would be sold, much like low-income housing tax credits, and that could raise a lot of money, because tax credits are an incredibly popular investment for corporations, for banks, for any operation that is making money. Especially for lending institutions, the big banks, they get a CRE credit, which they, love to do. They fulfill it. And we wouldn't have to sell any of the properties. We could just say this money is going to this group of properties, and they would not get the depreciation, which they normally get in a low-income housing tax credit. But what they would be doing is you'd be bringing private money into. They would have to oversee the rehabilitation, which would be a boon, because it would also take that responsibility away, from government. And I think it could be a great way to bring in a lot of money. Once you bring them up to a level where you're not constantly dealing with, another broken pipe because they haven't been fixed, and the infrastructure hasn't been really upgraded in a lot of these buildings because of lack of funding, then you suddenly get money that you could do real rehabilitation to ensure the long-term viability of these buildings. I think that's something like that has to happen, because the federal government, I think, is clear, is not going to be giving us more money. They are not increasing Section 8 funding. They are not increasing public housing. New York City, unlike other cities, everyone says, oh, there are towers in the park. Well, New York City basically are towers in the park. When you look around, the majority of buildings are high-rises, and our buildings are high-rises too. So it's not the liability that a lot of other cities, think it is. The other major thing is that when NYCHA was flush with cash, and when HUD was really well funded, they put on all of these programs, social service programs that NYCHA is supposed to do. The problem is we still have the responsibilities for their programs and zero funding. So they're unfunded mandates. And that is, takes an enormous amount out of our budget every year, which otherwise could be used for maintenance and operation of the buildings. We would love to do those programs, but we can't do it without money, because then we're taking a dollar that's supposed to go for one thing and then having to divide it into go to others. There are other, city agencies and federally funded programs. Our job should be to be able to connect our residents who need those programs with them, but to provide the services ourselves is a duplication of effort. And I don't think, we just can't afford to do it, and we're not seeing the money come in to do that.
When you say unfunded mandate, is it literally a mandate? They're saying that for this diminishing, in exchange for this diminishing amount of federal money, you must run program X, Y, and Z?
Well, it's not necessarily, they're not all not necessarily a mandate, but it is, they expect us to provide training programs, education programs, services that cover elderly help, and we love to do them, and NYCHA at one point was doing them well, but with the funding gone, it's impossible. So when I say unfunded mandates, maybe mandate is a little bit of a strong word, but they are programs that our residents got used to us providing, but we don't have the money to do it.
Well, money aside, do you think the methodology is sound? In other words, do some of these programs help contribute to, say, more stable families who are more likely to pay the rent on time and otherwise contribute to the overall project?
I think that, some of them are good, but if they're not funded well and we don't have as much expertise as the other government agencies who just concentrate on those types of programs should do, then I think it's something that either somebody comes up with the money or we let those agencies that really know how to do them with, making sure our clients, who are residents are connected with them. And those two things, we need more money we got to address the buildings. And I think Julia was absolutely right. When you look at, after Sandy, our buildings stood. They didn't crumble, they didn't fall apart. Some of them got flooded, but they stood because they are solidly built. But they need the upgrading.
And one last question. You said earlier that the proposals for renting, or I'm hearing it referred to as infill, but renting or leasing parts of the footprint in some developments, that it won't provide the money that's needed for upkeep. That sounded like you all have sort of run some models and tried to figure out what's available.
I mean, it's the estimates are like $50 million a year when everything is fully done. $50 million a year is going to be helpful, but it is not enough to make up for the cumulative deficit of $1 billion that we've lost because of the federal government. And it will be absolutely helpful, but it's just not enough. We need a large influx of capital dollars to do the repairs that are necessary.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Damaris, if you can take us to the view from the inside as an advocate and a resident, what are your greatest concerns about the funding issues, and what do you think is the way out?
So, well, clearly our greatest concern about the funding issue is that the developments will be allowed to continue to deteriorate, and then we will have to employ programs like Hope 6, which, all due respect, were intended to, solve the problem of distressed housing, but in fact, in many cities, has resulted in the loss of thousands of units of public housing. We have evidence of that here in New York. There is a Hope 6 program here. It's in Brooklyn. It's called Prospect Plaza. And so we've lost some units there. There's something creative happening there now. But nonetheless, we don't want to see any more units lost. I think that from the inside, first I'm a resident, and I've been doing this work for quite some time. And we clearly understand NYCHA's fiscal issues. We also believe that it is smart to look at yourself as a way to generate, and look at the assets that you have as a way to generate revenue. The problems that we have with the proposals that are put forward right now are that we don't believe that, one, they are fiscally as smart as they can be. You only have one chance to dispose of public land. A 99-term lease is practically selling it. None of us will be here when these leases expire. And residents and advocates feel like there are many other things that can happen. I just want to take us back a little bit to a few things that were said that I think need to be responded to in the context of, vision. So, public housing was a New Deal program. It is one of the few that's left, and many folks criticize it, and that's part of the problem. The reason why we get very little, we have diminishing support from Congress and the feds is because of the negative perception of public housing. But from our standpoint, public housing is one of the most successful public programs. I want you to imagine New York City without public housing. If we airlifted public housing right out of the city and everyone who lived in it, this would be a drastically different city. We would lose so much of our diversity, both ethnically, economically, racially, culturally. And the people who live in public housing and the contribution that they make to the city of New York and helping this city to run. So from our standpoint, that public housing is successful. It has helped to continue New York's legacy, right, of being a city where people come to, where it's a melting pot of folks. If it were not for public housing, low-income people in New York would have to completely leave, because while we don't like to look at it as, the option of last resort, it in many ways is not, because we think, oh gosh, we don't want to, folks don't, want to live there, but because there is a lack of affordable housing in this city. There's no accident that there are over 160,000 people on the waiting list. That has a lot to do with, the fact that many New Yorkers and their income cannot keep pace with the rising and escalating costs of New York. And it can also, and should not be looked at this point, as transitional housing, which is what people believe it was intended to be, in a market like New York, where market rates are $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. We were laughing the other day, some friends and I were like, where are all these people coming from that can pay these rents? But they're coming, many of them are coming, and many New Yorkers who are here cannot afford to pay those rents, right? People live doubled up. Aside from being an advocate, we also provide housing counseling services. So when I speak about these issues, it's from a real point of view of folks coming to our office, looking for housing, in rental arrears, looking for work, and having a really hard time being able to locate or secure housing in our own community on the Lower East Side. So we're just, saying, I felt like those points needed to be made. The future of public housing and what I think needs to happen, well, I think one good start is to begin to look at what kind of revenue the Housing Authority can generate from, some of its options and its assets. This particular plan, again, there's a lot of criticism, and we are not in favor of this particular plan. I just want to also say that for the record. And we are currently working with many of the resident association leaders in the 8 developments. There are 8 developments in New York City where the land lease proposal will take place. So of those 8, 5 of them are in the Lower East Side, and of those 5, 4 of those developments and the resident leadership oppose this plan and are working with us in order to stop this process and begin a whole new one altogether. So it's not that residents don't get it. It's not that they don't believe that NYCHA has a shortfall and that we have to do something, but they believe that they need to be a part of that solution. And this plan, while there is a lot of conversation right now about where the plan is, and there's been a lot of presentation to residents regarding the details of the plan, the plan itself was not developed from its inception with resident consultation. And residents feel strongly that, and there are also other provisions in the law that say that residents needed to be a part of that process from the beginning. And that's a difference of opinion, and I get that, you know. I know the Housing Authority is doing what it has to do and believes that they're doing the right thing, but as an advocate, we have to, you know, and as residents, we have to also do what we believe is right to save public housing. And what we're scared of is that once we, you know, 80% of whatever's going to be built is going to be market rate housing. So from our viewpoint, once that kind of development occurs on the campuses of public housing, you know, folks say, residents say, once they get their toe in the door, the developers, it is gonna be, they're gonna run free. And once they see that this is successful, that they can take NYCHA land and that they can rent it out and that they can profit from it, there will be no way to keep them at bay. In a city in particular where real estate interests, you know, have so much power. So folks think that this is not really a plan to generate revenue that would save NYCHA, but that this is a plan that will, you know, open the floodgates and that will largely benefit private developers. And so I'll say a few things. I know you want to ask me a question, but here are some ways that right now we could generate some revenue. So first, NYCHA pays over $70 million a year to the New York City Police Department. Residents are essentially being double taxed. No other landlord in the city of New York has to pay for police services and police protection. Second, residents believe that there are many opportunities to look at the land and think about commercial and retail options. Many of the campuses are huge, and the nearest grocery store or the nearest retail outlet is, you know, several blocks away. So why not look at how do we take this land, create opportunities, bring much needed goods and services, probably jobs, you know, build up that local economy, but provide services to folks. There's also some growing opinions around New York City's film industry and how much revenue is generated by filming in New York and how much of that filming happens on NYCHA campuses, and why some of that revenue should go to fund public housing and not back into the, you know, city's general fund, when in fact that revenue is being generated off the backs of, you know, the developments. So those are just some, you know, loose options, but there's way more that people are talking about.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, I hear you saying two different things. That there was a procedural issue about whether or not residents were sufficiently included.
Sure.
Some of that could be, you know, we've got an administration that's going to have to get out of town in a few months. Maybe they're just going fast. But I also hear you saying that there's a deep suspicion of having residential development on the NYCHA campuses in the first place. So which is it? Which is more important? Which is the more pressing concern?
I mean,
because the procedure doesn't even matter, right? I mean, if you want to make sure that you're at all of the meetings so that you can tell them you think the whole thing should be scrapped.
well, of course the procedure matters, because with a different process, we might have come up with a different proposal. We might have looked at other options, but this is the only option that residents are being presented with, right? This 80-20 model of 80% market rate housing, 20% low income. And in many discussions with the Housing Authority leadership, we have, you know, essentially seen a very little movement or willingness to change or shift the basic bones of that proposal. So yes, process is, of course, important. Residents, you know, if you want resident support, then you have to have them feel like they have some ownership. And we refuse to also believe that in a city like New York, right, with the diversity of our residents, that there's a lack of vision on what we can do. Right? There are brilliant people out there that have wonderful ideas that we could look at. Yes, it's going to take longer, and you're right, Errol, this is also about an exiting administration that's trying to make things happen. We get that, but at the same time, you know, our job, and you and I, we've had these conversations before, you know, we have to think about not only what repairs have to happen now, and how much money is needed, but how do we address those issues while preserving long-term the future of public housing for generations to come? Because somebody like me, who lives there, would not even be able to live in the community that I live in had it not been because I was able to succeed my mother when she died and remain in public housing.
Understood.
Because I can't afford the rents in my neighborhood.
Okay. Rosie has been grappling with this, I guess, on a number of different levels, and I'm sure if you don't hear about it every day, it's only because you're out of town on that day, right?
Yes, Earl. It's a pleasure to be here today. For those of you who don't know, I grew up in public housing, lived there for about 20-odd years. We moved out of public housing, my family and I, when I was getting ready to graduate from college. So at the time, my father was working, my brother was getting ready to graduate, and 30% of a 3-working family income was more than the rents in the area. So back in the 80s, we were able to either rent anywhere else or buy, and that's what my parents did. They moved 1 block away from where we lived and bought a house. They still live there. That's not the option that's available now. You cannot just choose to rent near where you live in public housing or buy a home. We moved out because of ceiling rents. And so when we talk about encouraging mobility out of public housing, what happened was all these working families were moving out, and NYCHA came up with ceiling rents to stabilize public housing and keep working families in and have that economic diversity. Back then also, under the Koch years, there was a preference given to homeless families. And what happened in public housing is all these homeless families were coming in. The city was cutting back on a lot of services because of the fiscal crisis. And NYCHA, which was well-funded, started to provide those social services. The families needed them, and NYCHA had the federal funding to provide it, and the space in a lot of the developments to provide it. And that worked very well until the city got better funded, but still kept taking all this money from NYCHA. What you hear, the money for police, it's about $74 million. Pilots, payment in lieu of taxes. Considering when I first got into the council, we renewed 421A tax abatement to encourage development, which I didn't think we needed to encourage development at that point. 421A was created during the fiscal crisis of the 70s to encourage development, and then we needed it because everyone was fleeing New York. So we're giving all these developers these tax breaks, and it's unclear to me what we're really getting back in return. And with NYCHA, we're still charging them taxes instead of giving NYCHA something for the very special role it plays in this city, providing affordable housing. During the New Deal, public housing was created to provide low rent and habitable housing. So if everybody can remember back to 5 Points, that was New York City. That's where we didn't have light and air. First Houses, which is in my district, what they did was knock out every third building so they can comply with the new code of light and air. And it was a whole new world and a whole new model. Diseases were born in apartments back then until these changes came in the law to not have overcrowding, to have sufficient light and air. What happened with public housing at the time, you could build storefronts, and I forget when, I think it was the Stiegel Act, eliminated building commercial because public housing was supposed to provide affordable rents for tenants, not affordable rents for commercial tenants. But that created, I think, a separation. I grew up in Williamsburg houses, 4 stories, commercial space everywhere. So I just ran down through the block without crossing the street to buy my comic books, buy ice cream, buy my bubble gum, and I could run back home. I wasn't allowed to cross the street. Where Damaris lives, you got to walk 2 blocks in order to find a bodega or a deli to, never mind buy books, but get milk and eggs, cigarettes, cheese, anything like that. So I think we did a disservice then. And I think when we're looking now, when we look at public housing that is isolated, it's because they don't have the commercial storefronts. They don't have what Jane Jacobs talked about, that vitality in street front. And I think when we're talking about changing or modifying public housing, what my residents come back, and when I say my residents, I'm talking about everyone in New York City, because as the chair of public housing, I hear from everyone is they want supermarkets, they want banks. They don't have a bank or financial institution sometimes for more than a square mile distance. They want resources that they can go to, community-based health clinics. And this is, I think, a good opportunity, looking at this underutilized land, to put those resources in and bring economic development, jobs, and resources to the people who need them right there in that immediate area.
Is the administration open to that, to the extent that you've had those conversations with them?
In the city council side, we've talked about it. We've talked about these green markets and supermarkets. The administration kind of says yes, but we don't see any action. I like to point out that I find it interesting that after 12 years of Bloomberg in office, it is only last year, after all the Daily News report, that all of a sudden he decides he wants a board restructuring. He also proposed the board restructuring last summer, but to take effect in January of 2014, after he's out of office. I think it was on the part of the administration very knee-jerk and did not look at what was needed. When you look at the fact that the board restructuring the board we currently have now was restructured back during LaGuardia, and it was done for this very same problems we're seeing now. Not enough money to manage the authority, high crime in certain developments, and they restructured the board to have what I consider boots on the ground. You would have board members that really knew the developments and would come back and they would be paid, as opposed to these interim, per diem positions. The problem is that since LaGuardia, public housing has increased its portfolio and its units tenfold, and the board did not expand so that you could have those boots on the ground. And I think very well of the board now, but there were years where there were board members who were totally not in touch. They were no-show jobs. And I was not a fan of the appointment of Rhea, and I still stand by the fact that I didn't think that was a wise appointment. At that point, when Obama was coming in and we were poised to be fully funded dollar for dollar, that was a time to get someone with a housing background to manage the authority, not to get a banker. And so that we're going down this road of looking at this development in a very rushed way, I think points to the fact that we have a banker at the head of the authority, and we have a businessman as the mayor of this city.
Okay. David Gilmore, I realize I actually maybe shortchanged you a little bit in reading your abbreviated biography, and I want to make sure everybody knows that you were a receiver for the District of Columbia Housing Authority, the executive director of the Seattle Housing Authority, and the executive director of the San Francisco Housing Authority. So you've been all over the country, and we get into this sort of little bubble here in New York, where, as you can hear,
Do you
we're sort
really?
of intensely focused. Yeah, we hear there were places outside of New York. It's a rumor. Tell us, between Hope 6, your federal experiences, your read of where things are with HUD these days, is there a cavalry down in Washington that's going to come in and rescue us? And if not, what should we do?
Well, first of all, thank you for asking me all those great questions. I do have to say that I'm beginning to understand that I was invited to be here, because I am the quintessential outsider. But I may not be quite as outsider as you think I am. I grew up here in New York City. I grew up in Brooklyn, but I am not a product of public housing. I have spent my career working in public housing, and I've sort of formulated some views as to how things can be or ought to be. There's an advantage, I think. There's both an advantage and a disadvantage to being the outsider. The disadvantage is that I'm not sure I have a clue about what all these folks are talking about, except what I read in the paper. The advantage is, of course, that I can then pontificate on the basis of what I think is appropriate, and if I offend you, I offend you, or I make you mad, I make you mad. If what I say resonates with you, terrific, it's wonderful. I walk out the door and I'm gone off to wherever it is I go to do my thing. I have to say that when I was younger, a lot younger, I sort of prided myself in being both a practitioner as well as an activist in this area. But over time, the realities of certain situations just hit you, and it becomes clear that you can spend your time, if you wish, railing against the failures and against the attitudes that are pervasive locally as well as nationally, or you can recognize them as realities and just go try to figure out how to fix them. I want to make sure that everybody in this group here, and those that are watching on their computers somewhere, that's what I find to be an extraordinary phenomenon, by the way, that you all don't think I'm flying under false colors here. You know, I don't consider myself much of a policy guy. You know, I look at my good friend Joe Schuldiner and thinking that he ought to be sitting where I'm sitting, because he's been both the practitioner and the policy guy, and he has struggled really hard over the years and continues to do so to be able to figure out what some of these new paradigms are. What I do is I'm a mechanic. You know, it breaks, I fix it. But I fix them in the context of current situations, of current circumstances. All I can do, I think, here is if I were to contribute to the dialogue or the discussion, is perhaps to offer a couple of radical proposals and then walk out the door and let you guys go figure out how to.
Go back to the French Quarter, right?
And go back to the French Quarter, is right, yeah. Look, it seems to me in many, let me take a step back. If you listened hard to what, it's Ms. Reyes, I believe, right? Is that correct? Listen hard to what she was saying.
Or Damaris.
Damaris, okay. If you listen hard to what she was saying, I think that the plea that she's making sort of reflects what's happened, I think, in public housing over the years. And if you remember, everybody ought to know that public housing didn't begin as a housing program. It began as a works program. It was intended to put people to work back in those days. And I don't think that there was as much focus as to who this housing was to be for. But as it turns out, as you might expect and not be at all surprised, is that the recipients of housing assistance in those days were essentially white working class folks. And this is my perspective on life as I've come to know it over several years, and only my perspective. I don't represent anybody in all of this. But if you want to sort of figure out in the simplest of terms why we are where we are today, it's frankly because I think public housing over a period of time began to be for the least politically favored folks in this country.
I'm glad you
It's
said it.
less politically, these are folks that don't command the kind of representation, and haven't over the years, the kind of representation that they burn to have in their hearts, and I think as is reflected in what I'm going to get this
You
wrong.
got it right.
I got it, Damaris said. To be represented at the table, to be able to express an idea. Whether that idea is a good idea or not a good idea, it doesn't really matter that much. It only matters that there be an opportunity to express it. And I think that the predicament that has emerged with respect to public housing over the years, I think, is as much a reflection of the loss of political popularity of the clients in public housing as it is anything else. But that's a reality. I think if you look to the federal government to solve this problem, it ain't happening. And frankly, I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. That's a political reality. When I get sent into a city with a troubled public housing program, in my view anyway, it's always got to be in the context of fixing it with what you got, is trying to figure out how to make what you have work better. So here's is it okay to go toward a radical
Sure.
proposal? And
Sure, go for it.
let's see where it goes with it. It may very well be, and I've sort of come to this conclusion over time, that New York City is different than any place else in the country. Maybe size does matter. So maybe it ought to be that one of the ways in which you look to figure out how to fix the things that are broken here is to say that New York City ought to be subjected to a different set of rules than everybody else in the country. A different appropriation, a different funding source. I mean, does it make any sense, if you think about it, if Hope 6 works everywhere else in the country, but it doesn't work here for one reason or another, does it make sense to subject New York City to the same set of rules? If Choice Neighborhoods, the program that I work with fairly frequently, works everywhere else in the country, but it doesn't work here, maybe it doesn't make any sense any longer to subject New York City, or to judge New York City, or to administer New York City's programs on the same basis. So maybe there ought to be a completely different set of rules that apply to New York, and maybe you ought to not be competing with the Newarks and the Philadelphias and the Chicagos and the Los Angeleses and all of and every other little city in the country that lives by the same rules, that has to deal with this, for whom those rules may work. So maybe it doesn't make any sense, and maybe in fact there ought to be a division within HUD that works with New York City, and a whole different set of rules that apply to New York City, and so on and so forth. I don't know how you structure this, but I'm sort of suggesting that maybe it makes sense to do that. The other thing I'd say that I think you need to take a good look at, I think it makes sense to look at things like the leasing of land, spare land. You set some parameters around it that start off with a recollection that the Hippocratic Oath says, first, do no harm. And then you spring forward from there and make sure that what you do starts off with a recognition that there are people in this city that have some very deep need, and some of whom are your own clients, and you have to make certain that you don't hurt those folks. And then move on from there. But I guess I'm also suggesting that in addition to figuring out a different relationship at the federal level, that there ought to also be a recognition that the feds are not coming here on their white horses with bags of cash. It's not going to happen. And so whatever solutions you ultimately come to, or let me just say it differently, we ultimately come to, because quite frankly, if it can't be fixed here, it's going to be a problem for everybody in this country. That's the way that's the way I see it. But that the solutions have to be locally defined. You got to fix it where you are. Let's remember that this recent expression, too big to succeed, too big to fail, came out of this city. Remember? It may also be that with respect to public housing, too big to succeed should be the new phrase. And I think that you ought to have some dialogue in this city about the determining whether or not you are using this resource and administering it in the most efficient and effective way and making the best use of those limited dollars that you have. Do you have to abandon some of these programs that folks have talked about that are no longer based upon the old days? They are expectations now. Not we oughtn't to use the phrase. What's the phrase that gets used? Unfunded mandates. These are unfunded expectations that people have, and I think in the process of making things better, you got to reshape your expectations and got to figure out whether some of these expectations can't any longer be met, whether it's not economically feasible to do it. And I frankly would take a look at a different model in terms of how you organize and administer public housing in this city. A highly centralized system has been and will continue to be difficult. It may be impossible ultimately in the long term to administer. And I'm happy to have some more conversation about that at some point. But
Okay, I see many people. I'm not going to call on anybody. Jump in with whatever you think we've missed, and we can just have this as a conversation.
Well, I'd like to start with just pointing out something that I think everybody agrees on, and that's Rosie's point about the importance of retail and commercial in public housing projects. And, that was one of the most stupendous planning errors of public housing. And all across the country, the projects that hadn't been subjected to that principle tended to do much better than those that were. So I think everybody agrees on that.
I would say yes, and that's why when I said mandates before, I pulled back from it because that's not the right word. I do like unfunded expectations, I think, as a better description. I will say that one of the issues is I don't think New York City has the funds to be able to help public housing enough. And I think, unfortunately, we do have to turn to the federal government, but we have to turn in a way to present them with an option. And nobody commented on the tax credit proposal, but I'm telling you, we need something fiscally responsible like that to get the money here. Because the most important thing at this stage is maintaining those buildings and bringing them up to a level where they are not going to need continuous huge amounts of money. If you don't really address the problems and you just put Band-Aids on, the Band-Aids are going to keep coming off and you're going to have to keep going back. That is, so critical. And if you want to save public housing for the future, you have to be realistic. I agree. The feds aren't coming in on a white horse. The city isn't, and neither is the state. And so what do? You try to come up with structures. And I know it could be boring because it's financial, but you got to come up with structures, frankly, that will generate the money that's absolutely needed to get these, to really get these buildings rehabbed and retrofitted so we can ensure they'll last a long time.
NYCHA sort of put a toe in the water in that regard, right? It wasn't a brand new tax credit that was created, but they had to get some federal rules tinkered so that they could offer some tax credits. That was one of the first things that
Oh, no, that was.
That Chairman Ray
That
did, right?
was different. That's not what I'm talking about. There were 21 developments in New York City, some built by the state and some built by the city many years ago. And the city and state used to fund those with operating and maintenance, and then they both stopped funding. And so we were taking the regular dollars that were coming in from the federal government and having to add in 21 other developments with, was it 20,000 tenants in them, and have them covered. So what we did is the Fed said, okay, we'll allow you to put this many of them into public housing. But that's not what I'm talking about. It's a totally different thing. I'm talking about them creating a new tax credit that the funding would be used purely for the rehab. It's, I would be so happy to hear other ideas.
Are there any legal barriers to NYCHA doing that now?
Yes, because this program, the low-income housing tax credit program, is one where you have to sell the properties and you have to bring, it's a different structure. This is something that would just be targeted. And the low-income housing tax credit program, you're also in competition with every affordable housing developer in New York City. And, this is cheaper than them increasing our budget.
If I could
Have to
just
do something.
add that NYCHA was only allowed to federalize the 21 developments under ARA, the stimulus funding. So it was a one-time opportunity. They had to get it right. They had to do it within a certain timeline, and they did do it. New York City had many more city and state developments, and during President Jimmy Carter's era, he federalized like about 50 developments that then got into the federal funding stream, but these 21 were left out. So they got in, but it's not like they can do this again. So they're looking at other ideas.
Is there anything to be gained by making a decision as a city, one way or the other, about whether, for example, families in homeless shelters should get preferential placement on the waiting list? This is being talked about by the mayoral candidates, and some have pledged to do exactly that.
Well, as I said, we have about 20% now of the residents who were formerly homeless. And, having a mix, I think, is, important. But when I was talking about housing of last resort, is like, it's a difference between homelessness, bringing people who are homeless and those people who are working and making very low income. And usually what we have found is not all, but a number of people that are homeless need assisted housing more. They need special services. And those special services, are difficult, for us to provide. And so actually NYCHA, HPD, and HHC are making an announcement, I believe, today about a program to build more, jointly assisted housing to try to help, to address that population.
You know what I really is interesting about that question is that here we are. This is 2013, I think, isn't it? We're still talking about splitting the baby. We ultimately are. And the reason we're talking about it is because of the reality that there just simply isn't today and won't be in the foreseeable future enough housing so that we don't have to make choices like that. For every special category of eligibility that you create, you exclude someone else unless there's going to be enough resources to go around. And you know what? It's just it's hard to believe that we still talk about that in this day and age, in the richest country in this world.
Can I just want to point out that there was a preference, a priority for homeless families that you would receive if you were coming from a shelter. Those things changed several years ago as the thinking was about deconcentration of poverty and creating special categories and priorities for working families, to encourage working families to move into public housing. And so that's when we started to see a change. Now, homeless families have to wait like everybody else does. And, we can have a conversation about, why that is, what's wrong about it. But I just wanted to clarify that it was a policy before.
I want to also ask about what David suggested. I mean, you kind of went 80% of the way there. Let's go the last 20
Which
yards.
one?
Well, it sounded like you're saying maybe NYCHA would work better if it were broken up either by borough or otherwise trimmed down to some size, because probably better than most people here, NYCHA isn't just bigger than any other city. It's much, much, much bigger than every other city, right? I mean, I've gone to conferences where they talk about public housing, and somebody will get up and talk about the 400 units that they manage, and we're just so big. I mean, as an operations guy, if you were brought in and told, look, just fix this, is that what you would naturally consider?
There'd be, in my view anyway, a natural inclination to start with an analysis of whether the decentralization of public housing in the city would work better and be less expensive than it is today. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that it has to be a clear delineation, that there necessarily needs to be 5 separate housing authorities and 5 boroughs and 5 boards and 5 this and 5 that. It may be that the best way to do it is through a hybrid that suggests. But I do think that a boat is being missed here by not trying to figure out how you efficiently push out as much as you can the day-to-day decision-making about operational issues here. I don't know this for sure, but my guess is that if you asked the individual in charge of the maintenance program in Brooklyn whether he or she has the latitude to make decisions about how they deploy their workforce, the answer would be no. And whether they can make those kinds of decisions, which may be different than it is in Queens and different than it is in Manhattan, whether they can do that, the answer would probably be no, that somebody at 250 Broadway makes those judgments. And my view is you can't administer an effective and an efficient program that way, and especially in a city like
with all due respect, I wouldn't, and unless you spend a lot of time at NYCHA and understand how that works, making those broad-based assumptions, I don't think are accurate. So could NYCHA operate better? Yes. Everybody knows that. Have we made a lot of changes? I've only been there 2 years, but I have seen a lot of changes since I've got there. I like to think I've helped, push some of them through, and those changes have to continue to occur. But there's no magic wand that's going to do this, and the less people focus on the money and where it's coming from, the more issues we're going to continue to have, and that is a harsh reality.
But I mean, and I don't want us to chase our tail on this, but isn't the issue, Emily? I mean, you can't necessarily figure out where the money's going to come from if we haven't agreed as a city why we're doing it, right? I mean, if it's housing of last resort, you get one answer. If it's workforce housing to help working families contribute to the economy, you get a different answer. If it's a federal responsibility, you get a third answer.
Well, I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, who we house is more of a local answer, because the city has more control over saying, okay, we really want you to house more, because everybody we're talking about qualifies to get in to public housing. So that's more of a political city answer, and what we hear from the residents are, don't add a lot of homeless because they feel it's disruptive because of the services many of them need. There are other contingencies who want us to, increase the number, although 20% is a lot. We got 179,000 apartments. That's a lot of housing. So that we know that it has to be there. We know that it's absolutely essential. And so the real question is, how do you, if you get the money, what do you do? And that's why I'm saying it has to be a really well laid out rehabilitation plan that NYCHA isn't doing, but that NYCHA hires, get the really large construction companies, get an ACON, get, those size companies, get Forest City, and say, okay, you get these buildings, you get those, here's the money, do it as, developer at risk and fix the buildings. I mean, that we need something dramatic like that to happen to get us on an even keel footing. I agree that there's various other things we could do with, the additional land, and that we do need more stores and all, to be in the neighborhoods. And, that's all true, but that is not enough to get to the fundamental problem. And that's what worries me, because I don't feel like the discussion is necessarily on like the elephant in the room.
Could the discussion that you're talking about happen in public? I mean, I know the way HDC does its work, it's often been criticized, at least by critics or by advocates, as, being kind of conversations that happen and then the deal is presented and then HDC either votes it up or down, and there's not
HDC?
Housing Development Corporation.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Well, let me
understand the question.
let me put it this way: for what you're talking about, the tax credit notion, the big idea to get the big money to sort of help solve this problem, it would take a lot of negotiating with places like housing developers, with people on Wall Street. It would need to also include the tenants at some point. Is that a conversation you think the city is ready to have?
I think the conversation needs to be in Washington, because it's a federal program. It's an IRS program. Congress can say, yes, the Office of Budget will go through and say, this is the cost versus, which is always lower, because whatever the upfront money is, they amortize it, you get it over 10 years. So you're taking, instead of writing a $1 billion check today, they are not going to collect as much taxes on $100 million for
Sure.
10 years. But it doesn't really have anything to do with the others. Now, as far as the rehab that gets done, yes, the rehab that gets done obviously would take meetings with the tenants and with the P&A studies and all of that to be sure that we are doing everything we have to do. But to be able to craft something that can deliver the funding is what I'm talking about, and that is a federal-only discussion.
I was just suggesting, and I guess we don't want to speculate too much on it, but unless the cast of characters that I named rode down on the Amtrak together to go to the halls of Congress, they're not gonna let you do any of that stuff. Right?
I think that's true, and I think what you really need is, to be able to have serious conversations, with our congressional representatives about something like this, and get the support, and have the tenants and the local electeds support it and say, this is one way to get some real dollars in here. So on that, if that's what you were saying, I apologize.
Yes.
I misunderstood you, and I agree with
Gotcha. We're going to invite the audience to participate, and we have some questioners circulating with mics, so you don't have to signal me, you should signal them. But before, as we start that, let me ask you a question, Rosie. Some of the lowest hanging fruit that we heard from Damaris earlier, and which has gotten asked at some of the mayoral forums, is the idea of eliminating this payment to the NYPD that drains, $75 million from the Housing Authority. Is that something the City Council could simply order the next administration to do?
Well, we've been trying, and I've had a resolution to undo the MOU, and that's gone nowhere. There's been no political will on the side of the mayoral administration. At this moment, the 5 Democratic candidates for mayor have said that they would undo the MOU and give that $74 million back to NYCHA. So I'm working really hard to get myself a Democratic mayor, as I did 4 years ago. But now there's going to be something really in it for public housing. The other thing is, during my 8 years as chair of the committee, I've been asking the Housing Authority to show me and show my committee what is the above baseline services that we're paying $74 million. To date, I've not received it. So I don't know of why we're paying the money, and I don't see it in the developments. My residents don't see it. There is no above line services except that the Housing Authority gets a report of who may have been arrested, and then they go forward with evictions. Whether it was, a mistaken arrest or not, the resident finds themselves in an administrative hearing looking at a possible eviction.
Can I just say that there is no real rationale. The only reason, one of the primary reasons that the Housing Authority pays for these special police services is that we used to be well-resourced. The feds used to give us a lot of money. And during a time when the city of New York was not doing well fiscally, they found ways to fund and take federal dollars. So now it's time for the city of New York to pay back, right, that favor, while NYCHA is not doing well.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Joe Schulden. I'll just speak about my New York experience. First of all, sorry.
You make sure everybody knows who you are, Joe.
Well, I was just about to say, first of all, I was the Deputy Commissioner for the Office of Property Management in the second Koch administration when we made the decision to put homeless people in public housing. I had the responsibility for finding them permanent housing, and of course my reward was to become general manager of Housing Authority, the third. Not that it hadn't been done before, because Simeon Golar emptied some of the welfare hotels when new developments came on. In other words, anyway, I kind of start this at a different place, and then I'll get back to Henry, because I do think the tax code is probably the only answer for the big bucks. I think it was mentioned before that public housing by David was a works program by earlier speakers that kind of its mission was set back in the 30s and 40s about being providing safe, decent, affordable housing for low-income Americans, depending where the program is. That we need to kind of change the mission, and that might inform what the answers are. And I think the mission should be larger, that this is too narrow a mission, because it supports and in fact enables what's happened in both New York and everywhere else, which is that public housing became first insulated and then isolated. I think you have to have a mission that's larger and more community driven, that the object really has to be not just about finding affordable housing, but it has to be in viable communities. So it has to be part of the authority's role to help the development of the community, the larger community in which it is located. If you have that kind of approach, then what's actually kind of happening now, but certainly didn't happen in my day, would be that you have more interaction between the housing authority and the people making planning decisions on the different levels. I mean, even though I come from HPD, we didn't have regular meetings with HPD about, hey, here's a neighborhood, what are you going to do about it, and what are you going to do about it? That kind of situation. So I think that if you, it also goes to an issue that I'm sensitive on, that Julia mentioned. I'm not in favor of time limit in public housing because, again, the issue should be more neighborhood stability, community stability. I don't want, I mean, you historically about 15%, not in economic times like these, historically 15% of housing authority people move anyway. So if you had like a 5-year thing, you'd be making 35% move a year, and that would be a destabilizing impact, in addition to what the cost would be to prepare you. So, you know, the answer to that is maybe going to more the old British model of council housing, where people stay in the neighborhood and then they get supported where they are. It's not a, it's a different approach. But I just want to go quickly to, I think the tax code is the only answer. I don't think this Congress for any foreseeable time should actually provide money, and I don't think HUD's going to even ask for it, even if Congress would provide it. So to get that, I do, whether it's a special tax credit or even making use of the existing low-income housing tax credit, 4% tax credits, I also think, you know, the inhibitor here is the political climate about the concept of selling. In order to use a tax credit, the person who buys the tax credit has to be at risk. They have to be the owner. But the reality is those ownership enterprises are limited partners and general partners. The general partner is usually 2 or 3% ownership, but they control everything. The limited partners are people who put up the money and don't want to know from anything other than the project's okay and they're not at risk of losing the tax credit. So, for example, if even using the present system, if NYCHA could self-develop or not self-develop, if that limited partnership, if that general partnership of 2 or 3% was divided between the NYCHA and, say, the residents, or among developer, the NYCHA and the residents, you'd actually have, and you could explain this well enough, you might actually have some support for approach. The last thing I want to mention, I actually try to look into this, but unfortunately my law experience is not that, so I don't know. I do think there is a potential of money through depreciation. If you are conservative and say NYCHA units are worth about $100,000 a piece, that's $20 billion right there. Even at 27 years, depreciation, that would generate $750 million a year in depreciation. But again, it can only be used if there's an entity that pays taxes and is out there. So I do agree with Ms. Youssef that that's probably the answer, but it does need to have a much, I'm not in a position to say what the relationship is now, but it needs a strong relationship between the residents in terms of what we're trying to achieve. And I think if community building were the mission, is a better platform for doing.
I would just like to say one thing, and that is because I was president of HDC when I got there, I was able to happily broker an agreement, an MOU basically of types between HPD, HDC, and NYCHA to cooperate. We agreed to do certain things for one another, and when we're talking about supportive housing, we've also brought in HHC, and that's something that's different for NYCHA, and I think it's something that's important because you do want to try to do things together. Additionally, we did get a grant from HUD for a C&I grant for choice neighborhoods. And through that, we are working with all the community groups. We're concentrating in Mott Haven and doing every other city agency. So we are trying to do that more because you're right. There was a tendency at NYCHA to be like everything within NYCHA. And there's been a push and an effort to try to be more involved with the communities and with other agencies that impact those communities.
Next question, yes, Ron.
Ron Schiffman from Pratt Institute. I just have to say, I think Joe was the last time we had real professional leadership at the Public Housing Authority. I think Emily's being there is a great step forward. And I thought the last part of the discussion, and particularly Joe's point about community building, is important. But your last question and Emily's agreement was basically around the issue of leadership. And I think what we have lacked in this city is leadership on public housing from the political establishment, and particularly the mayor. And while I agree with both of them that the tax code is a way to go, it's not always the most efficient, although it is the most politically palatable one. There are other ways of doing it. The communities around public housing communities are now growing very, very rapidly. In the old days, they weren't. I remember, by the way, when New York City was losing population and was losing housing units, and the way we reversed the decline in the city of New York is by stopping the hemorrhaging of housing and kept rehabilitating it and making sure we weren't losing it. The programs I see about selling public housing land and an 80-20 percentage in a city where median income means 50% make more and 50% make less. So when you go to 80-20, you're actually subsidizing the wealthy and not the lowest income families in the city. Those kinds of policies have to change. And we have to not only address what the federal government can do, but what the city can do. And there are many of these communities around where Damaris lives, around Gowanus houses, around Red Hook houses, and many communities in the city of New York where the homeowners surrounding them, and I'm one of them, can afford to pay a little bit more in a surcharge on their real estate taxes. And that should flow to the communities. When my son, who's going to be 50 soon, was a child, he went to a daycare center which was in public housing that we could walk to. There isn't any reason we shouldn't be putting back daycare centers and starting to think about universal child care again in the city. Failed public housing is not the issue. It's a failed economic development policy in the city of New York that subsidizes the large-scale developers more than it subsidizes the economic viability. It has strategies that move higher and middle-income people into the city rather than providing opportunities for people in public housing to become the next generation of middle-income and higher-income families. And so we need to start thinking about leadership in this city, and maybe it's a long-term goal. But it's something that I've seen reverse over the 55 years that I've been in housing and community development in New York, that really could be reversed if we really had the leadership and the followership to demand it. There isn't any reason we can't use the retired, tax transfer tax, some sort of tax on every transaction in the state of New York. It's on the books. We rebate it every day. That generates billions of dollars a year. What if we did that to create jobs in the city and the state and targeted it to public housing and infrastructure that we desperately need? So we need local leadership as well as congressional leadership to fight for these things. And it's something we shouldn't just put the burden of stabilizing public housing on the backs of the residents who live there.
Where's the next mic?
Good morning. My name is Ramilda Ferguson. I'm director of the Housing Division for Local 237 Teamsters. We represent 7,000 of the workers in public housing, 25% or more who also live in public housing. And a lot that was said here I agree with. And not only am I representing the workers, I used to be a manager in public housing, and I grew up right here on the Lower East Side in Reese Houses, so public housing is very dear to my heart. And a lot what Damaris was saying about the monies that was taken from public housing. I was a manager during the boom when we were trying to spend the federal money real fast because if we didn't spend it, we had to send it back. But I do believe whatever issues and whatever answers we're going to come up with, it has to be a dialogue. There's two constants in this equation, the residents in public housing and the workers in public housing. And I don't believe that they've always been involved in the conversations on how we go about to save public housing because we have the same desire to save public housing. And what's going to happen in the end of this year, we're going to be dealing with a whole new board probably in public housing and what's been going on. They never sit down and have this dialogue because there are ideas out there from workers in public housing. We understand the financial crisis that public housing is undergoing now, but we're trying to save it too. But I don't think that we've been engaged in that dialogue along with the residents to sit down and to see if we could come up with some ideas that would be, it may not make everybody happy, but it's something that we could live with to make sure that public housing goes on. Because as I said, I grew up in Reese Houses. I had the best childhood going. And I think that people who are coming behind me should have that opportunity too. But you have to involve everybody in that dialogue, workers, residents, along with whatever exec board or whatever way you're putting it in. When you start excluding people from that dialogue, you leave out a lot of ideas that may have helped in the long run. Thank you.
I'm Joyce Miller, and when Joe Schuldiner was the Deputy Commissioner of Property Management, I was developing the low-income housing tax credit program for the city. Emily, I think it's an excellent idea, and I think that there are some ways that it could be done. I think that you have to think very creatively, as Joe suggested, about how you constitute the GP, and I think there may be some ideas that we could toss around about how to do that.
That would be great.
The other piece is that I think that assuming that there is some kind of infill program, it's going to lead to development in the surrounding area. And I think that the city should be encouraged, and even without an infill program, you're seeing development in the surrounding area. And gentrification, as much as we don't like to see that all the time, but it's nevertheless a fact of life. But NYCHA should be benefiting from it. And there should be, why not have a development tax or a TIF related that has dedicated funding going to NYCHA. A third idea, and this I don't know, you'd have to look into it to see if it's possible. But the Mitchell-Alma program at the state level was just transferred from EDC, and I'm on the EDC board, to Housing Community Renewal. And my understanding is that EDC is losing a major source of its revenues because the revenues from the Mitchell-Alma tax bonds are now going to go to HCR instead. And I'm wondering if it wouldn't be possible to tap some of those funds also as a source of income.
Right, thank you.
Hi, Alex Schwartz here at the New School. It's an excellent discussion. Following up on the ideas of the tax credit, one thing that I haven't heard is mention of the new rental assistance demonstration program, a federal program, which I believe includes the tax credit as an option, and it also involves the idea of being able to borrow money from banks, issue bonds to pay for the renovation costs, and have some of the debt service paid for by the federal contributions. It's a small program. I think about 60,000 units are authorized, I believe. But the president is there, and it does include the option of the tax credit, but it also relates very much to this issue of how to think about public housing and its governance. And it means a much more decentralized approach, much more so than the idea of a borough-wide approach, where each project would become, in effect, an independent entity, as far as I understand it.
Well,
and so there's a huge issue about accountability and governance, so you retain tenant, interests, input, and so on. But I think it's worth discussing. And
we've done a lot of research on RAD and had a lot of discussions. First of all, NYCHA was excluded because we were too big, so they didn't want us to participate. And then when we did, the issue we have with RAD is you don't get an increase in the subsidy. So it's the same amount of money you get now on, a project level. And if you take those dollars and you just use them to securitize the cash flow, it wouldn't be enough to pay the debt service on a bond and actually do the rehab, because we're underfunded. So.
I had a question for Mr. Gilmore. What messages are the Fed sending with regard to public housing access for people coming out of prison? And how do you see this playing out, either, I know you're working on this in New Orleans, but from a more national lens?
You're asking about the initiative that we've undertaken in New Orleans to change the way we look at criminal histories in terms of both admission to public housing and to jobs. I think and it's interesting too, because we're working with the Vera Institute on this effort. Our aim is to eradicate this barrier that exists, whether it's real or whether it's perceived, that if you have if you're a convicted felon and have a background of criminal history, that you either can't get in as a resident or you can't get a job in public housing. And I think from our perspective, what that tends to do is to sort of perpetuate this treadmill that folks that have had some exposure to the criminal justice system have to endure in their lives. And in a nutshell, it's this, that we're trying to work it out so that unless you have a criminal history that puts you in a very limited category, having committed some of the most serious offenses, violence and child abuse, or you are a sexual predator, that you won't necessarily experience that barrier to admission to public housing, that in fact we won't bar you from it. And in fact, if it's your intent to live a productive, decent life, you're going to have a chance to do it because you can get into public housing under the new system, and you can get a job working at the housing authority. We'll see. It's brand new. It remains to be seen. But I have every reason to believe that at least for the folks that we engage in this process, that notion, the old notion that seems not to be true any longer, and that is, once you've served your time, you've paid your debt to society. That turns out it seems not to be true because you're barred from one activity or another, and that the housing authority's been a participant in that bar sort of comes to an end.
Earl, I have to leave. I'm needed for a vote at land use. But I just wanted to say one thing before I leave is about the infill development. So we really, haven't gone into depth about it. But one of the issues, the 5 developments are in my district and Margaret Chin's district in the Lower East Side. One of the big concerns of the residents of the Lower East Side is 4 of these 5 developments are in the flood zone. The one that's not in a flood zone is a senior building that was crippled and these individuals could not get out of their building and didn't have to mandatorily evacuate. And that in one of these developments in Margaret Chin's district, we're talking about putting 1,000 units and putting 1,000 families right in the flood zone and trying to evacuate those families, which we all participated in. Emily Damaris and I, was a huge effort. And now we're talking about putting more families in harm's way. So that's one of the things that hasn't been discussed at all of these community consultation presentations that NYCHA's been doing, and something we want to start the dialogue on. So just wanted to make
Thank you so
that.
much. We've only got time for one more question anyhow, so thank you for staying with us as long as you did. Who's got the microphone?
Wow, I guess I get the last question. I'm Stephanie Green. I'm with the West Side Federation for Senior and Supportive Housing, and I don't think that going to the federal government's a bad idea at all. I think it's something that should be explored, but I want to go back to this question about how much political support for a local response to the economic problems that NYCHA is facing. How could we develop that better? Because it's lacking in terms of what approach could be taken with the next administration for the city to take more of an economic responsibility for NYCHA's problems outside of the just cutting back on that police requirement. And it seems to me, I'm from New Orleans, and so I think New Orleans can teach us something as well. I think New Orleans is very similar to New York right now. Didn't used to be, but after Katrina, the city of New Orleans really relies on Hanno to supply the low-paid workers that fuel the tourism economy in New Orleans, whereas previously there was a lot more affordable housing before Katrina than there is now. And I think the same argument could be made here, and Emily, I think you made that argument, right, which is that there is an economic argument for why, outside of the fairness that Damaris pointed out about we need diversity in our city, there's an economic reason, perhaps, for the city to acknowledge that NYCHA residents contribute to the economic success of the city, right? And I'm wondering if any efforts have been made to make that argument If not, could we be making those arguments? And I'm curious from David, have you seen anything elsewhere in your work where the city has been successfully brought in to support the local housing authority?
It's interesting because I was the executive director of the Housing Authority in Seattle for a while. Seattle is one of the few cities in the country that actually taxes itself to support affordable housing. Realized long ago that its future couldn't depend on the federal beneficence forever and ever and ever, and it taxes itself to do that. I'm not sure I heard correctly, but I think this gentleman here was talking about, to some degree, a way of city residents being taxed or taxing themselves to provide that sort of affordability.
You wouldn't be very popular here, David.
I'm sure not.
Right.
Yeah.
But, so can I, right.
Yeah.
Many homeowners who surround these areas who are benefiting from
Sure.
the quality of better maintenance of public housing themselves. You go around Gowanus houses today. Years ago, the income was just a small differential between the surrounding neighborhood and the residents in Gowanus houses. Today, they're surrounded by $3 million homes whose real estate taxes are capped at a 6% increase, I believe, per year. To put a surcharge of 2% on them, they wouldn't even notice it, but it could go into benefiting the residents that live there. We now have, New York State could collect billions in the tax transfer tax, a simple Tobin tax. We have it on the books. Koch forgave it while you were working for him, I believe. We haven't collected
He didn't do it.
in years. No, I know it's not. I praised you before, and I meant that. So. But I think we need to start looking at those things. They could be de minimis, but they can have an enormous impact on the quality of housing and do far more than building these tall structures adjoining public housing that will dwarf the existing public housing in order to make them economically viable.
Damaris.
So, I agree that a tax would be an interesting way and a smart way to generate revenue. I think, though, that Emily is right. It may not be, whoever brings that up will not be popular. And so I wanted to say that to then address what you said about making the argument about the economic argument. So we do make that argument. We make that argument all the time. We make the argument that NYCHA, that public housing is not a failed program, that it contributes to the economy, that that we provide workers, that we help a city remain diverse. Here's the problem: the reason that we are in this situation has so much to do with what David talked about earlier. It's the people who are making the argument. This is a race issue. And I'm sorry to, somebody has to say it, but we have been dealing with institutional and structural racism. When public housing was first created, it was not created for low-income people of color. It was created to create jobs, and it mostly housed working-class whites. This is just the reality. When public housing residents were largely white, there was plenty of support from Congress. And as that changed over time, as developers understood that public housing was growing across the country and so much housing was being built and that they needed to have their market share, and they began to build suburbia and attract whites, and we had white flight, as all of that happened, and we had a migration from the South of blacks and Latinos came here, and we became the population, that support changed. It dwindled. I wasn't around. I didn't make this up, but I have done extensive reading and research around all of the things that happened. So if we do make those arguments, but y'all need to make those arguments, and that is the issue. We need the support of our fellow neighbors to say that what is happening is not the right thing. Every time there is an article in the newspaper, and I want to challenge you all to see what I'm saying, to prove my point. Every time there is an article in the newspaper about public housing, you know what I do? I read the comments that people write. Do you know why I read the comments? Because it fires me up. Because it really makes me angry when I see what it is that most people really think. What do they think? They think that we in public housing drain their tax dollars, that we are lazy, that we are criminals, that we do not work. They do not understand or see the value of what we bring to the city of New York and to many cities across this country. So we make the argument, but we need you to make that argument with us. That is what we need. Because I can talk to Congress till I'm blue in the face, and I have testified before Congress. We've discussed all of these things at length, but you know, I'm still Damaris Reyes. I'm still a poor Puerto Rican girl from the projects.
You get the last word, Damaris Reyes. Thank you all so much. Join me in thanking the panel, please. Okay.
So we should talk about the tax credit thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
set something up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think
Yeah.
it's really hostile. Hi.
Local 230. I represent the workers in the housing